Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Pole Position. We are back. We're having fun. I have more than one guest on today because I thought it would be fun to get together a load of people and have a great discussion and answer some silly questions that we put up on Twitter. So who have I got on with me today? I'm going to start with the lady who I've got on today, and that is Sam Knapton, who is a university professor, adjunct professor. I don't know. She works at a frigging university at the University of Nottingham. She's awesome. She works on DPs. One of my bestest friends, absolutely fabulous historian. So we're going to have a lot of fun with Sam today. My second guest is, oh God, does he really need an introduction? It's Roger Moorhouse. I mean, come on. If you don't know who Roger Moorhouse is, go back onto the podcast, go onto the internet, go onto Twitter. You'll freaking know who Roger Moorhouse is. He's published fabulous books. We all know this. He's one of my favorite people on this planet, well, except for Sam. Oh, I don't know. Oh, I don't know. Hold on. I might be sticking myself into a grave here. They are two of my favorite people in this world. Third, we've got Konrad Werner, who is a professor at the University of Warsaw. He's not a historian; he's a philosopher, and I've kind of pulled him onto this. Why? Because I just thought it would be fun, just to kind of mix things up a little bit. So, hello to my wonderful guests onto my fabulous podcast. Hello, everyone.
Hello, Alina.
Hello.
Hi. So we've got lots of questions. We've put questions out onto Twitter. We've got some questions I'm not going to ask that were on Twitter because we're not going to go down some of these rabbit holes because it's absolutely ridiculous. So I'm going to throw the first question out because two of our guests obviously are not Polish, but they do work in Polish history. So Sam, why do you work on Polish history?
The short answer is that I'm not sure. When I started doing my PhD, it was very much more focused on Germany, and frankly, Poland was more interesting. So what I ended up doing was actually looking at Poles within occupied Germany, but I only kind of skirt around German issues and more focus on the Anglo-Polish relationship and displaced persons camps. One of the other reasons is that even throughout my entire undergrad, master's, PhD, I didn't know anyone who taught Polish history at British universities. I know that some people definitely do, but it's very concentrated in particular departments. So what we're actually seeing, this is a very long-winded answer, but what we're actually seeing now, especially at my university, is we've got the children of people who came over in 2004 attending university. And they came over at maybe 2-3 years old, and they don't know anything about Polish history. And then all of a sudden, Polish history is given as an option, and they're really just clinging on to it. And yeah, the more I learn about it, the more I'm interested in it. So I have become a bit of a phonophile.
You got to publish that book because I know people that keep asking DP questions and I can't answer them, and I sound like an absolute idiot when I try and go down that road, trying to remember the podcast that we published a couple of years ago now, isn't it? I think.
Yeah,
it's been a while. You've got to come back on and update us on some of your research, Roger. Why Polish history?
Yeah, it's well, two people's fault. The first one's Lech Wałęsa. And the second one's Norman Davies. So Lech Wałęsa, I found particularly 89. I found fascinating, and everything that went before it. So the whole solidarity thing, which was to be fair. I mean, we're probably going to go on to, how Polish history kind of always falls through the cracks. But I think solidarity was one of those moments where it kind of didn't, and it was on the evening news every evening when things happened in Poland. So I kind of got a bit obsessed with him and with it in the sort of mid and late 80s. And then 89 happened, which I just found fascinating. And then I wanted to go to university. I'd already left school and was working, and I just found it all so fascinating. I thought, I've got to go and study this. So I went to CEAS, University of London, specifically to do Central European history. And then I ended up in my third year doing Norman Davies's modern Polish course. Loved that. Loved Norman, and we ended up working together. So he asked me to be his research assistant, which I did. And it all sort of went from there. So, I mean, to some extent, a little bit like Sam, I've kind of defaulted to some extent to German history, but then Polish history, like you said, Sam, is actually just much more interesting. It's more complex. There's to a large extent, there's a more appreciative and engaged audience for it, which is important. So I actually, like Sam said, I actually find Polish history more interesting.
When's your next book out?
August. In the
Fantastic.
UK.
Yeah, we've got to come back. I love the subject you're going to be talking about, well, the Holocaust and the Ładoś list, which many people don't know about. So we're going to get you on and do loads of stuff on that.
Come and talk about it again.
Exactly. Let's ask our last guest, Konrad, why are you not a Polish historian?
It's a good question. But actually, I don't know. I'm very much interested in history, Polish history included, of course. But if I am supposed to add anything to this question of why studying Polish history when you are not Polish, I can share a kind of related issue, namely, there seems to be something attractive in Polish cultural legacy, so to speak, not necessarily Polish history itself. And I don't share this story very often, but the story of my family is a particular example of that. Namely, my family came from Germany or German territories, so to speak. And so they made a choice to be Polish at some point. And I guess that there are many people in history, recorded in history, who actually made such a choice, coming from all around the place. And so there must be something quite attractive. And I wonder, what is your perspective? What you think of this attractiveness of Polish legacy? That perhaps, well, after all, I'm a philosopher, so I have to speak of ideas. So perhaps there is a certain idea of being Polish, and this idea is surprisingly sexy, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so I wonder what you think about it. But as I said, it's not an academic issue, but still, I'm very curious about it.
I get that. Can I jump in there, Lena?
Of course you can. Take it over. Go for it.
I get that entirely. I think there's two things I just mentioned when I was answering the previous question. For us as Brits, you do feel when you do Polish history, to some extent, you're banging your head against a sort of a brick wall, because for a lot of people, I'm sure Sam would say the same, there's kind of just no recognition at all. It's a lot of people couldn't even find Poland on the map, and there's no understanding of Polish history at all. So nothing even to kind of latch onto. So which makes it quite difficult. But that also is quite part of the challenge, and quite part of the appeal, I think. But then to go back to what Konrad was just saying, I think it is that. And to me, it's like, Poland's certainly in the modern period. So sort of, from the partitions on, effectively, the modern period. Polish history is so full of unbelievable jeopardy. That there's risings, there's times when Poland didn't exist, and then what's the Polish nation going to do? It's occupied by 3 countries, blah blah blah. All that stuff that we know. There's such tremendous jeopardy at any point that I think that actually makes it absolutely fascinating to me, because it could have gone in any possible direction, and yet you end up with what we have since '89. You've got a democratic Poland that's now, certainly since last year, absolutely integral part of the EU and playing a hugely vital role in the whole situation with Ukraine. This wasn't a given that you'd have this end result, and I find it's the jeopardy in it in the modern period that I find so fascinating.
I've got a question, Roger. Who was because this is an idea of identity, which I find this fascinating. I'm going to bring this onto the table because I'm going to simplify it, obviously, because it's much more complex than this. And this is something I wanted to cover on the podcast, but it's proving to be difficult for any Polish historian who wants to speak English to be able to come on the podcast and talk about Polish identity. But there was, and you're going to have to remind me, the name of this was an admiral or a general during the invasion of Poland, he was from German roots. What was his name?
Unruh.
Yeah, and he basically, when he met up with the Germans, he refused to speak German. He was like, even though
Yeah.
he fully understood
Yeah.
everybody, it was like, my identity is Polish, and this is this. That's it. That we don't go beyond this.
So he actually spoke supposedly only rudimentary Polish. He was essentially German. He was, I think, raised in Germany. He'd certainly served. I think he even served in the German Navy in the First World War. And then because of that, the identity was through his parents and so on. He kind of joined the Polish Navy in the Second Republic, so post World War One. Got to the rank of admiral, very senior man, and was I'm trying to remember, was he the commander of the Held Peninsula? Was that what it was?
Yes, that one, yeah.
And then he was taken prisoner by the Germans and promptly refused to speak any German with them. All the way through his imprisonment, by the way. He was in prison for most of the war. All the way through, he had to have an interpreter, even though he spoke better German than he did Polish, which I think is just hilarious.
Sam, how do you come across in this? I mean, this idea of being Polish, especially let's bring something else to the table. Being British and working in Polish history, this obviously has a lot of hurdles within it. For example, from my own perspective, I have 2 foot in each camp. I'm very lucky. It's easy for me. I speak the language. I communicate well. I can read and everything else. But I also face hurdles, not as much as you guys, obviously. So tell us a little about some of these kind of hurdles that you guys face.
Well, first and foremost, just the Polish language is a massive hurdle. I am just extremely stubborn. So what I ended up doing was going to night classes for 4 years while doing the PhD, and then eventually got some funding to be in Suwice for a few weeks at the European University of Alina, and then eventually last year, as you know, Alina, I was in Warsaw for 5 months because I was a junior research fellow at the Poetic Institute, and that very much accelerated my ability to speak Polish. So language is definitely the major thing because Brits in general just are terrible at languages. And this is like very much a fault of the school system within itself, but also this idea of exceptionalism. Everyone speaks English, therefore we don't need to learn anything else. But when you don't speak another language, you're not just losing that ability to communicate with other people, you're losing so many other things as well. Just empathy for one, cultural understanding, just all of those things. So language is utmost biggest hurdle. I have had quite a few people, I wouldn't say have a go, but maybe aren't too happy about the fact that I don't have Polish roots and I'm doing Polish history, because it's very much to them in particular. I think it's very much it's their history. What am I doing with it, sort of thing. This is the other hurdle that I come across quite a bit. As I said, I do German and Polish history. I do find Polish history, especially now, a lot more interesting. But I never came across this in Germany, and I think a big reason for that is because so many people have been involved with German history and talking about German history for so long that it's kind of been, it's not that it is their history, but it doesn't quote unquote belong to them. The rest of the world has pitched in, they've given their opinions, they've written books about them, etc. Like some of the major scholars are British for German history, whereas the same can't be said about Polish history. Norman Davies, obviously, amazing scholar. Robert Frost, for instance, amazing scholar. But there's only a small handful. Yeah. And it's that in itself is quite a barrier. There is definitely a protectionism around Polish history, I think, as well. And we are in no way here to be like, this is bad, this is good, or whatever. What we're interested in is just trying to understand it and actually communicate it to the wider public a little bit more, especially in Britain for me, because so many people are interested in it, but they just know nothing about it. As Roger said, like it's kind of like, it sounds horrible. It's the new shiny thing in many ways, because people are inundated with TV programs about Germany. They already think they know everything. So it is really hard to teach undergrad students about German history in general, because they just parrot back documentaries. Whereas Polish history, they don't know anything. So they either have to really engage or give up. And many of them really engage because, as soon as they hear about the partitions, and as Roger even said, I know I've been talking for a while now, so apologies. But as Roger even said, like, it's this whole like jeopardy thing. Like, so many students have no idea that this even happens. So they even get like a taste of it, and they're like, "Well, what happened next? Like, Poland is a country. What are you saying? That Poland didn't exist?" And I'm like, "Yeah, literally. Like, didn't exist, and they just don't understand it, can't comprehend it, and it's kind of like it just hooks them in.
Yeah, I get that it is infectious. I get that a lot with, I get readers when I sort of work in a slightly different world to you, Sam. I'm sort of where I give a talk and it's sort of public facing or whatever, and then you get people who, there's because I've done German history as well. So in my head, what I'm trying to do, the German history books has a sort of set market, World War II, Nazi Germany, that everybody knows that stuff, and people will go out and buy, every book that comes out on Nazi Germany or World War II, whatever it is. They won't necessarily buy a book on, the September campaign or the Polish Underground or whatever it might be, because it's Poland and they don't know anything about Poland, right? So they have this sort of barrier. But if you do both like that, then you can almost try and drag the readership from the German stuff and drag them into Polish history and go, okay, you know all that, but what about this? This stuff is really interesting. And I've had people come up to me and say exactly that, right? And say, well, I bought your book on Berlin, and then I bought that one on September 39, and I just couldn't put it down. I thought it was amazing. I've never known anything about Polish history. So you're kind of dragging them into this strange world, which is actually only the country next door, right? And it's actually a related history, but it's just one that we never cover. So like you're saying, I get that it's completely infectious, actually, the sort of fascination with it. And I don't know quite what that is. Maybe it is what we're saying about the sort of the jeopardy and stuff and the sort of sheer drama of it. But it is definitely infectious. But the other thing, like riffing on what you just said, you said that there was that sort of sense, a little bit of protectionism with some Poles, and towards you. I mean, that's something I haven't ever had. I have to say, I think the Poles have always, all those that I've ever interacted with, they're kind of delighted that somebody. I think that somebody in the outside world, as they would see it, is interested, right? Because I think one of the strands of Poland's many and varied neuroses, and we all have them, every nation has them, but one of the strands of Poland's neuroses is that the outside world doesn't care and isn't interested. And so consequently, whenever I'm in that situation and people go, oh, have you got Polish forebears? And I say, no, nothing. So, that question always comes up. Why do you do Polish history? Well, as I said before, Norman Davies and Influenza, and they're kind of fascinated. And it's always been a positive conversation. There's never been that sense of sort of, a sort of proprietorial, concern, why are you doing this? There's a level of engagement with Polish history in the public sphere, which is way beyond what you get in German history. In German history, generally, people, certainly Germans, just kind of shrug and they go, "Oh, it's another foreigner doing German history. Oh, great," and they kind of, I bet they're doing the usual suspects, yeah, fair enough. But Polish history is it's real engagement, and people are kind of, they can be aggressively interested. But I've never had that sort of rejection thing.
Yeah, just to clarify, I've had both
Right.
things. So I have had people be like, "Oh my God, you're an outsider who wants to talk about Polish history. That's amazing." But at academic level, I've definitely experienced the "Why are you doing this? This isn't your history."
Okay,
thing
that's the reason. There is the big divide between academia and public history.
Right.
Because no offense to my no offense to my academic friends in Poland. I know some fantastic academics. One is sitting in the room right now. But at the end of the day, they're very closed off when it comes to talking about public history. And I say, well, why aren't we not engaging further on in the Western world? Oh, well, like Roger, you say, oh, well, they don't understand us and they'll never Well, hold on a second. But if we start educating, we start speaking about it, we start bringing it to light and making it more engaging, exciting and interesting, people are going to want to know and hear more about it. So you've got you, Sam, on one hand, where you're trying to push through academia, as there are other academics doing the same. And Roger, there's less public historians trying to push on Polish history, so it's kind of this unbalanced weight between the two, and we still have to crack this. And then the other issue for me, the biggest issue for me, is that, well, we've discussed this, but language. Now, not everybody is able to learn Polish, as we very well know. It's a very difficult language, and having access to sources, it's really difficult. Students, for example, Sam, you've come across this problem where your students can't read the sources because they're in Polish. And how are we going to come across this? How are we going to get over this barrier? Well, we have to start translating more. And this is what I'm trying to push for Polish institutes and funding and the government and whoever the hell wants to get involved, is to start helping translating all of these documents, and which will make it readily accessible to academics, to people. And then people can look at it from a completely different perspective. And this is what history is all about. There's not just one side of the story. You interpret it, well, obviously there's certain facts that are one side of the story, but people interpret things differently. That's why you have different books written on different perspectives, how this was, where, why, and how. And that's what we need more of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And certainly, there's the recent, comparatively recent series of diplomatic documents that's been published by PISM, in English, which is fabulous. I mean, that's a great thing. And of course, you were involved with the most recent of those, Alina. But that that is really, really useful, and that can stand alongside the FRUS and the DGFP's documents on German foreign policy, because it's all in translation. So there's no reason for Western scholars, particularly on the diplomatic level. All of that material's there, and it's all in translation. So get out and use it. And so PhD students, you can do that. If you're doing Polish diplomacy, absolutely. So it's that is absolutely the direction you have to go. But there's a bigger problem here, which is that I think Poland itself, whether that's government circles or academia or the media, whatever it is still too obsessed with talking to itself, particularly with history, right? I think they need to, and it is coming. It's sort of slowly coming. There was that small foreign ministry prize for foreign language history books, which I was very pleased to have won a couple of years ago. But that's a good example of trying to encourage the outside world to write about Polish history, right? I had to throw it in there.
I had to laugh. I'm muted here and I'm laughing so loudly.
But that's a good example of trying to open up, and encourage the outside world, not the non-Polish world, to write about Polish history. And there are other examples. But then you get something like, that I always bang on about this, the Katyn Museum in Warsaw. And I love the Katyn Museum. I think it's brilliant. But still, the argument I always have with them is that, the captioning and stuff, there is some captioning in English, but it all needs to be in English. How can you spread the word about Katyn without English language captioning? It just doesn't work. So, there's still work to be done. And it's a mindset problem as much as anything. There's still too much of that mentality of literally talking to themselves and not talking to the outside world.
No, I was actually going to ask you, Konrad, to jump in on this, because I was wondering what your perspective was from, history adjacent discipline, essentially. Is this a thing in philosophy as well?
To some extent, yes, but it's becoming less and less relevant, so to speak, because people are much more, I don't want to say open-minded, but perhaps more courageous, as it were. And this relates to what I wanted to say, namely, so one thing is, actually, I have one question and one remark, so perhaps I will start from the remark. So I guess that Polish academia is, so to speak, closed because going outside the academic circles, strictly speaking, is just more challenging. So it's just more difficult. There are certain frameworks in which you must fit, let's say, and you have to communicate within a certain academic framework, and you can master the language of this specifically academic communication. Usually it is English, but it does not have to be English, but usually it is English. And so you can master this Congress English, so to speak, and you can fit this specifically academic framework, and you can feel safe within this frame. Whereas going out and doing certain, doing this reach out to a wider public, it's a completely different standard. Also, when it comes to your English capacities, and you have to struggle. I'm right now struggling doing this thing. So it's just more difficult. So I would let's say, set it forth as a kind of explanation of why Polish academia is not that open or not sufficiently open, if I can put it this way. But I guess it's going to change sooner or later. So this is one remark, and then there comes a question. I wonder to what extent, when you have people who get familiar, at least to some extent, with Polish history, I wonder what is your impression? Do they treat this specific history, I mean Polish history, as something original, quite exotic, but not necessarily part of universal history or European history in general, but something just something interesting? Or perhaps they spontaneously take Polish history as part of this more universal history, that you cannot understand certain things happening, for example, in the 16th century Europe without Poland. Or perhaps they just take it as something interesting, because I see a difference here regarding something as interesting but still quite exotic, and regarding something as interesting and being part of this universal history.
Before we jump into this question, I just want to add one comment, and I completely and utterly agree with you with the language barrier thing. I had a debate in Opole last weekend where I had to do the debate in Polish. My God, can I explain to you all the terror that went inside me? And I literally cried myself before I had to do it. It was so difficult, and I was forgetting words, and I forgot how I wanted to say something, when in English, it would take me 3 minutes to explain what I wanted to say. In Polish, my God, I was sitting there babbling on for 5 minutes, going, oh, did I just say what I wanted to say? Sitting on my phone and Googling words. It was absolutely beyond terrifying that I had to sit there. So I have had experiences both ways, and I completely commend any of my friends who are Polish speakers and who have to go out and do conferences or talks or whatever in English. You guys are awesome. And anybody who does that, I think it's absolutely amazing. Anyway, back to the question. I see Roger's ready to go with a comment.
I was going to throw it at Sam, actually, horribly. I was going to throw Sam in on that one.
Make Sam do it. That's fine.
Answer Konrad's question. I mean, I've got a view on that, but I was going to throw Sam in because she's an academic, so.
I can do it from a teaching point of view, definitely. So, yeah, I mean, at first, I think the initial reaction is one of exoticism, where they're just kind of like, oh, this is new, this is different. You know how you use the word sexy before I use the word shiny? Is this something sexy, shiny, new? And initially, that is the reaction if they're only taught one part of history. And in my experience, you then need to push them to make them see that it is part of a bigger structure. So, for instance, I am not an early modernist historian, and this year I taught on the Masters in Early Modern History at Nottingham because there was no one else to teach about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So I spent a good 3 weeks preparing for a 4-hour session because I was terrified I was going to mess it up. But what the feedback that I actually got from the students at the end was that it was kind of like a missing piece to the puzzle, essentially, because they've been so focused on Britain and France and places that are now, Spain and Italy, etc. But they didn't know anything about this. And I was like, really? Because it was massive. So you would have thought at some point someone would have connected that. But every single one, there was only 8 in the class, but every single one of them in their essays brought in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and they didn't realize how integral it was. The way that the class actually runs is they have a 2-hour session, then 3 days later they have another 2-hour session. So the first 2-hour session was me just telling them what the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is and then discussing it. And then the second one was when they came back and they were like, my God, this actually makes much more sense. In the modern period, it's very much the same, but to get students to understand that it isn't this just shiny thing that's abnormal and that's why we want to look at it, what I tend to do is teach Polish history in relation to the countries that are surrounding it, because they're much more familiar with, unfortunately, German and Russian history than they are with Polish. So if I can relate it that way, then they see how it's part of a bigger whole more than anything. I know Norman Davis would love this, but my second year option is called In the Heart of Europe. Modern histories of Poland, and it very much starts with like the idea of whether or not Poland is a colony or a colonizer at the end of the 19th century, and then it goes right up to Lech Wałęsa, essentially. But this is much harder as well because students don't have any the only way that I can ground them in knowing this history is by teaching them it in relation to Germany and Russia at the same time, because otherwise it's just like, okay, so Poland. And that way they see it as a bigger whole rather than just this exoticism.
I mean, that's where I was going to come in as well, is that, you know, talking about the 20th century, you know, our schools and universities to a large extent for a long time have sort of majored on, you know, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, Cold War, you know, the Holocaust obviously looms very large. And yet, in spite of all of that, and you know, in spite of all of that, Poland still sort of falls through the cracks. And yet, you know, if you kind of put one eye on Poland through that period, you see it's absolutely central to everything, to all of the other stuff, right? Because it's the expansion target for both states that we're talking about, Germany eastward and the Soviet Union westward. It's, you know, if you talk about the Holocaust, you know, half of the dead of the Holocaust are Polish Jews, and most of the killing of the Holocaust takes place on Polish soil, right? So it's absolutely central to that as well. So how it manages to sort of slip through the cracks in the English speaking historiography, I still don't quite understand, because it you know, it should be absolutely front center. So it's quite a feat of kind of, you know, myopia that we collectively don't see Polish history. But once people do begin to see it, this has come back to Konrad's question, once people do begin to see it, I mean, it initially does have that exotic element. You know, the names and the languages is tremendously exotic and, you know, very foreign, and, you know, looks like a bad hand at Scrabble. All of that stuff, you know, there's all those jokes that we've all been grown up with over the last 20 years. But then once you begin to see it and understand it, it actually it becomes the key to almost everything else. You know, certainly in that modern period, if you look at, you know, like I said, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, you can't understand that without looking at Poland as well. So it's a bit of both. You see it as the appeal is initially the exoticism, and then it becomes an integral part of that grand sweep that you're talking about, Konrad.
Let's rattle a few things. I think.
Just one thing.
Go for it.
Because when it comes to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, on the one hand, it was large and powerful, at least for some time. But the problem that we have in Poland, in our consciousness, let's say, is that this country, I mean, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, itself became irrelevant at some point. So at the beginning of 18th century, it's completely irrelevant when it comes to being a subject of history, not just let's say an object or a victim of history. So to some extent, it's our fault, our own fault, so to speak, that we allowed for a situation in which we became irrelevant. So it's no wonder that people regard us as irrelevant if we actually became irrelevant at some point.
Yeah,
and then we, of course, we lost our independence.
I mean, and this is I've made this argument before, and I'm not sure if it's entirely empirical, but I'm not sure it's entirely wrong either. Is that, you know, crucially, Europe's, you know, most of Europe's universities, or certainly that sort of massive expansion of the university system in the 19th century, coincides with, and the development of the idea of public history as well, which kind of isn't much of a thing before that. That period coincides with a period where Poland doesn't exist. It's not on the map, right? And I think that's partly why, you know, you've got universities that have very well established German studies department, German language department, blah blah blah. I mean, there must be 100 or 200, you know, of those departments in British universities. And the same thing, to a lesser degree, but the similar story with Russia and Russian history. And then how many, I don't know if Sam knows, but how many departments of Polish history are there in British universities? A handful. You know, so but I think that the root goes back, you know, 19th century, it goes back to that. That's the beginning of public history as a sort of as a discipline in a way, and as a way of looking at the world, and it coincides with a time when Poland didn't exist. I think that's not accidental.
Sam, do you want to add anything before I move on our conversation?
Well, just, yes. So when I started putting this second year module together, by the way, this module, it hasn't actually run yet. It's running this year for the first time because it's taken so long to put together because I need enough sources in translation to be able to even just run it. So doing some of it myself, asking Alina for help with some of it, and then also having those wonderful works that we were talking about before. But just in the UK, I was looking at other examples of modules just on modern Polish history, and there's a small handful. So you've got the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at UCL, and there isn't a modern Polish history module anymore. There are ones that are tied to film and literature, but not history, like not a history specific one. And then there's a rather big collective in Aberdeen that focuses on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
That's what we're from.
Other than that, yeah, exactly. And then other than that, it's just smatterings here and there. Few in Cambridge, few in Oxford, some at Warwick. But it's very few, and some at Manchester. It's just very few and far apart.
Okay, let's
That's a
do a little
shame.
bit of history fun, I think, just to shake things up a little bit. We've been quite serious. Let's not get so serious now. So we're going to stick to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And as Sam has taught a module on this, I thought she'd give us a summary of why Jan Sobieski was such a great military leader. Go.
He was not. No, I'm kidding. I haven't a clue. I don't know.
I'm winding you up. I thought it would be fun. Never mind. Let's move. I was going to pick on Roger, but I thought you're the easier target right now. Okay.
I am, so thank you.
So let's look at this. So we've got some questions up. I'm not going to read all of them because, again, we don't need to be too depressing. So let's think
but the problem is that he was not such a big king. He was a big great military leader, but not that big a king. And this is a problem. But just, sorry, I had to jump in.
I mentioned the leader thing. So you didn't mention king. I mentioned the leader thing. So I was on the right track. By the way, I had to use Google for this because I'm awful at that time period. So we've got a question from Alex. I'm going to read it out. So who is the one person whose historical standing has changed either negatively or positively in the most recent times in terms of Polish history? Sam, you've got to have someone that you think.
Well, I guess Witold Pilecki, because he's not really. I mean, he's now well known, but he wasn't for quite a long time, and that's because basically his legacy was suppressed under the PRL, under the communist-controlled regime. So we're now finding out a lot more about Pilecki. I mean, there's the Pilecki Institute that obviously kind of carries his name, but then in popular circles as well, we've got Jack Fairweather's book, for instance, The Volunteer, that has come out and started talking about Pilecki. So there's really it's an opening up of like shining a spotlight on particular individuals within Polish history, but also to tell like a wider story. So I think Pilecki's a good example of that.
I love it. I love Pilecki. It's a great story, and it's a story that deserves to be told more widely.
Definitely. Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
Can I throw someone into this? I mean, I don't really want to talk about it, but thinking.
What are you talking about?
I don't know. I just want to mention it because it is a bit of a hot topic. And funny enough, he came up twice on the news today and one on social media, and somebody else posted something on Reddit. Is Lech Wałęsa, because funny enough, Roger's mentioned him already today.
I was going to mention Wałęsa in this context.
Yeah, let's talk about. I mean, I want to cover a couple of other questions, so let's not be too long on it. But so, for example, he was always seen as this hero, especially during the Solidarity movement. He was president, etc., etc. But in the most recent years, and we know this is also to do with politics, and it's a much deeper rooted cause that we probably would need a whole 6 hours to probably delve into and explain. But he has been seen much more negatively. Could it be due to age? Could it be? I don't know. Roger, what?
Yeah, he was. When you asked the question, that's the name that I immediately had, and partly because, as I said at the beginning, he was very much at the root of my interest in Polish history, and to be honest, I still would count him as one of my heroes. So he's someone that I kind of don't want to have toppled in that sense. And I don't, and for that reason, I haven't really, looked into the issue of, his potential complicity and so on with the communist regime as an informant. So it's it's very unhistorical, but it's not really my period. But I have just kind of, averted my gaze a bit because I don't want one of our heroes to be toppled in that way.
Well,
So yeah, but he's one that I would put into that category, whose perception has changed, public perception has changed radically. And as you say, I appreciate a lot of that is political. But I'm still stuck on that heroic figure for the 1980s, I think, and the way, I mean, we know how the way communist systems work. I mean, they work by effectively compromising people to a large scale, and using that then as leverage to make people do what they want them to do, or to do nothing. Either way, it's a very insidious way of working. And if that suggestion that he was an informant for the communists is true, it doesn't sort of doesn't detract in my mind from the amazing things that he did as well. If anything, if he was a communist agent, he was the worst communist agent that there has ever been, because he contributed to the collapse of communism. So who won there?
should I throw one more into the hat?
Go.
So very recently in Poland, there was a bit of a useless scandal. It was pointless. I mean, obviously, around the world, we all know who John Paul II was, Karol Wojtyła. And recently in Polish politics, some smearing started going on that he knew about all of these scandals of priests and young boys and things. But his support has not changed, but people are trying to look at it from a different perspective. So that's something that I'm kind of throwing a little bit in the hat. I recently went to Washington, D.C. and went to the Shrine of John Paul II. And the things he did, especially in his time as Pope, is incredible, especially for someone who didn't live through the communist period and actually watched through an exhibition and through videos of what he did. Incredibly powerful person. So hopefully his stance will not change. I don't know if Sam wants to jump in on this.
I have no idea if his stance, if his view will change.
I think it's interesting. I think it's part of that. I was in Ireland last month. Gave a couple of lectures in Dublin, and in a sort of strange way, I see there's often parallels, both historically and in another sense, between Ireland and Poland. The Catholicism, in a sense, the small country living as the plaything of a big country. In Poland's case, two big countries. The perception that they are on, like with the British, look down on Ireland historically. They see Ireland as more primitive. Not now, obviously, but in history. And in the same way, the Germans looked down on Poland and saw Poland as more primitive than they were. And that was tied up with their Catholicism and all of that stuff. It was all part and parcel in that Protestant mind of the Catholic other. So in that sense, I think there's kind of similarities. And then you look at it now, and you've got Poland is still kind of resolutely Catholic, and that sort of, certainly compared to Ireland, which is in the last 20 years has had this really galloping secularization. A lot of it led by this revulsion against the crimes and misdemeanors of the Catholic Church. So in Ireland, so I wonder if that is a sort of a coming parallel, perhaps, if not necessarily take it away from let's take this not to depersonalize it away from John Paul II, but to look at maybe that's the sort of a Trojan horse for a coming revolt against or a questioning of Catholicism more thoroughly in Poland. Maybe that's coming in the same way as it has in Ireland the last 20 years, which is now almost, certainly, obviously Dublin's not representative of the whole country, but you can see that it's that the Catholic Church the grip that it had 20, 30 years ago on Ireland has been substantially loosened, if not shattered entirely, which is remarkable. And I'm not saying it's necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just a remarkable thing. And maybe what we're seeing there with criticism of the former Pope is the beginnings of a more resolute questioning of Catholicism in Poland as well.
Konrad, want to jump in on this at all? Anything to add?
Well, I'm not a specialist in all the church issues. But I would hope for some change in the perception of John Paul II, and not in political terms, but in philosophical terms, because, well, his role in the collapse of communism and so on and so forth, it's undeniable. It's obvious. But so the problem is that on the one hand we have this great figure, political figure, which is fine. I mean, but this is not the only aspect. And on the other hand, we have this childish saint, not a saint in the proper sense, but this childish representation of the saint, all these terrible monuments, and whereas I would say that we don't have to, but it would be nice to rediscover John Paul II as a thinker, as a philosopher. After all, he was a professor of philosophy, ethics in particular, before he became a cardinal and archbishop of Krakow. So he was a poet as well. So there is this intellectual dimension that I hope that it's strange, but I hope that because of all these accusations, people will start to investigate more, will start ask more questions about this particular man, and therefore they will discover or rediscover this man as quite an interesting figure.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's not a direct link from all these controversies. There's no direct link from all these controversies going on right now to the intellectual figure, but perhaps there is some kind of indirect link. And I hope that if people start to talk, they will also rediscover this intellectual dimension, because I'm not a specialist in Catholic thought and Catholic philosophy, if there is such a thing. According to Father Bocheński, there is no such a thing. But if there is such a thing, as Catholic or Christian thought, Karol Wojtyła is quite a significant figure in this specific environment, and he should be rediscovered.
I like that. Nice little ending to that little part of the discussion. I was going to not allow Roger to talk about the Polish cavalry because there is a question, but we are slightly running a little bit out of time. Each of our guests is going to have to go to this one important question, and that's your myth, inaccuracy. What really pisses you off in your research that people keep repeating and repeating and repeating, and you just want them to shut up? And I want to let Sam take the floor first. I don't know why. Because you know why? Because on my screen, you're the first one on the screen. So you're always being thrown under the bus first. Sam, what pisses you off in your research the most? What crap do people keep sprouting?
Well, yeah, you mentioned this to me very recently as well. Is that people think of displaced persons camps as some sort of holiday camp after the war, where people just were in pure luxury, just lying around waiting to be taken home or resettled elsewhere. And the truth of the matter is, I mean, many displaced persons camps, some of them were very nice, but it still wasn't a pleasant experience. And I think a lot of people conflate this idea of displaced persons camps and being a refugee and the end of the war with, I don't know, somehow they see it as like being a modern day prisoner where you're given an Xbox or whatever in your jail cell, that sort of thing. They think they're sitting there in luxury, just waiting to be transported home with all of the necessities and things that they need. When in actual fact, you know, you've got about, I don't know, 100 families within an abandoned warehouse that are separating their cubicles using blankets. For the kids, it's great fun. Most of the time, they're running around playing with other kids that they've never seen before, so they're having a wonderful time. But for adults, it is horrendous, and especially for, as you know, if you read my book, the Polish displaced persons in the British zone, they're constantly getting pulled apart from other Polish displaced persons in order to enforce essentially boredom and to make sure that there are lack of opportunities in British occupied Germany, so they will repatriate. So there's this constant pulling apart and just enforced idleness. And then they get blamed for also being idle. So yeah, just people thinking the Displaced Persons Council is some sort of like nice relaxation spa after the war that the Allies are paying for, and it's luxurious in some sort of way, is definitely not true.
Did they have an orchestra?
Ah, this question again.
That's simple.
Well, no, this is one of the things that Lena and I have spoken about before in the podcast that we did, is because the British wouldn't even allow Polish Displaced Persons Council to have an orchestra after October 1946, because then you're just too entertained, apparently. So there was a law brought in on the 1st of October 1946 that said any Polish displaced persons camp with 100 or more Polish displaced persons cannot have any recreational or educational activities. So they were essentially enforcing boredom.
Wow, that's harsh.
Yeah.
Jeez.
So no orchestras.
I'm not gonna use the comment. That's why I asked you if there was an orchestra. I'm not gonna repeat that comment because I'm gonna have to edit myself out anyways. Roger, I will allow you to go forth with your cavalry.
Yeah, the cavalry thing. So the great myth of the Polish cavalry charging German tanks, which still rumbles around. I mean, I'm trying to kill it. One lecture at a time. Does drive me a bit nuts. I think it's getting less and less. I think having the book coming out, First Fight in the UK, and it was called Poland 39 in the US. I think that might hopefully we can try and kill it off, expose it to the chill winds of truth, and kill off the idea that they charge tanks on horseback. I mean, it's an interesting. I go through it all in the book, so I'm not going to rehash it here. Anyone that's interested, buy the book. That's all I'm going to say.
Hold on, is that a way to get people to buy your book?
Yeah, absolutely, shameless. But then the other thing I'd interestingly say, I mean, this is talking about undergrounds. I've been doing a bit of work on Polish underground recently, and one of the and it's slight tangent to your question, but this sort of British obsession with the Maquis, the French underground, which comes from, I think, a little bit of people like my generation grew up with Hello Hello, and then people a bit older than me grew up with, was it called Secret Army, and that sort of that drama series about the French resistance and so on. And there's this sort of lazy, and you see it occasionally in public history, but this sort of lazy description of the French resistance as being the most thoroughgoing resistance organisation in time Europe, and you think, no, hang on. So my second rant would be that how the hell did the Polish underground fall through the memory hole as well, because it's infinitely more interesting, thoroughgoing, efficient, everything than the Maquis, and let's restore that to the historical record rather than carry on lauding the Maquis, which is not worth that much interest, really.
I'm going to add to this because I don't care what anybody says. Any of my historian friends that are going to criticize me on this, you can go jog on. I love, and my grandfather, before he died, obviously, he was watching it, is Czas Honoru, or in English, Time of Honor. It's a great series. Okay, so it's not based on 100% truth. And yes, they compiled hundreds of different testimonies to kind of create this idea of resistance in Poland. But it's great because it gives you an idea of what Warsaw was like. It gives you an idea of what the resistance was like. And it makes much more sense to show the terror, the horror, how people rounded up, life in the Jewish ghetto, the Warsaw uprising, the ghetto uprising, and then even post-war. So I would advise people to go and download it. I think it's a great series to kind of give that idea. And my granddad got to relive his heydays, apparently, when he was watching it. He'd always comment. He'd be like, well, that's not what you really did, was it? Well, we didn't do that. And I was like, oh my God, like crazy stuff coming out my grandfather. Konrad, have you got anything you want to add to this? Is there something that you hear on social media or something, because I know you keep reminding us you're not a historian, but you still understand history. Is there something that pisses you off?
Well, many such things, but perhaps I should just do this thing more relevant to our topic and to Polish history. So I will share an anecdote with you. So a couple of years ago, actually many years ago, I met a guy in a lobby. Actually, it was the lobby of the philosophy department in New York at NYU. And we started chatting. He asked me, what is my what is my specific field within philosophy, and I said philosophy of mind and cognitive science and so on. And he said, like, oh, I heard about Polish logic because it's quite famous, but I didn't know that you had philosophers of mind and cognitive science. And my reaction was, so what did you think actually? What do we do? So perhaps this was just one instance of such a ridiculous conversation, but perhaps I should conclude with such a hope, let's say, that I don't want to go through another such conversation anymore. And this is somehow related to this issue of to what extent Poland is regarded as part of universal history, intellectual history as well. So that's it for me.
Can I add one? Am I allowed to add one?
Of course.
I want to add one.
Yeah.
I want to do my usual that mine also starts with a story, and people usually ask me why I became a historian and family history usually. What got you interested in Auschwitz? Well, I had a great uncle who ended up in the first transport, and the first question always is, "Oh, so you're Jewish?" This is my issue. First prisoners, actually the official first prisoners were 30 German criminals from Sachsenhausen, but the first mass transport was 728 Poles that arrived at Auschwitz with a handful of Polish Jews. They were not arrested because they were being exterminated during the Holocaust, but because they were intellectuals, part of the resistance movement, or they were caught trying to cross the borders to get into Romania and to get to the Polish Free Army. And it really winds me up, because people think that it's just about the Holocaust, and it's not. There's so much more to that history. And ironically, I was just watching a TV series, and my blood boiled within the first 60 seconds of watching the series, because it announces and talks about Auschwitz, and the first camp, or the first part of the camp, was a prisoner of war camp. And I wanted to yell at the TV. And the person who created this series, I also yelled at them because it's absolute shite. And they keep spreading this disinformation, and it keeps coming up in popular history constantly that it was a prisoner of war camp. It was not a prisoner of war camp. So that's my little short rant there. Is there anything that our lovely guest would like to add into our conversation? Something we've missed? Something maybe we need to talk about a little bit more?
I think we've done it justice to a large extent. I mean it's just amazing. Again, like as that Konrad story just now, it just shows you how Poland is, is just off the radar for so many people, and I find it so weird.
And not just history, philosophy.
And not just history, obviously, as well. Yeah. So within other disciplines, there's the same kind of myopia going on. It's weird. I just find it very strange. But that's our job in that sense, in the history sphere anyway. Lena, you do a great job at being the sort of public face of Polish history, and you do very good at that. And long may you reign. Put it that way.
Well, long may you all reign, because I'm not just the only one. This is a collective. I'm losing my words here. It's a collective. God, I'm thinking in Polish now.
Effort.
And that's it. That's the word I'm looking for. It's a collective effort, because not only one person can conquer, it takes all of us. And people like Sam, who are working in academia, my God, I do not envy the amount of work you're having to put into creating these modules. It's incredible. And it's amazing that you have students that want to learn about it as well.
Yeah, that's great.
Actually, I have quite a lot of students who are on philosophy degrees who are just like, I really want to join this module. And unfortunately, Nottingham just has so many students in the history department, we can't allow philosophy students to join the module, and it's really sad. I'm
It
like,
says
some of
something
the
interesting about philosophers. I hope.
Okay, I think this is a nice little conclusion to our subject, to our topic. Please remind our guests the names of your book, Sam. I can't remember, something on DPs in the Polish zone.
Polish zone?
The British zone.
I mean, there was a Polish zone, but still. Yeah, no, it's a horrendously long title, so without any snappy short bit at the top, because my publisher said that it would be, what was the word, Googleable. So welcome to academia. So it's called, what is it called? It's called Occupiers, Humanitarian Workers and Polish Displaced Persons in British occupied Germany.
And where can they get it? When can people get it from?
They can get it from Bloomsbury's website, but also, WH Smith's and Walmart apparently sell it as well.
Walmart sell it.
Walmart sell it. I've made it to Walmart.
Wow, in the big
When
leagues
you've
now.
made it, it'll cost them $110 at Walmart, but they can buy it.
Roger, name of your book. I know my brain's dying now.
The last UK, the Polish campaign 39 in the UK was called First to Fight. In the US, it was called Poland 1939. Before that, there was the Devil's Alliance on the Nazi-Soviet Pact. There's a lot of Polish history in that one. And the next one, which is coming out in August in the UK, is on the Ładoś Group, and that is called The Forgers. It's in August in the UK and in October in the US.
Fabulous. Konrad, do you have any books that people might want to buy on philosophy?
Well, I don't expect many people actually buying my book, but still, my recent book has a great title, namely, the title is The Embodied Philosopher. And then the subtitle is Living in Pursuit of Boundary Questions. So I guess the meaning of boundary questions is quite specific logically, but still, to some extent, I guess that our questions, the questions that we've been trying to ask and answer today are kind of boundary questions as well. So perhaps it fits.
So there you go. If you're interested in philosophy, grab yourself a philosophy book. Two fabulous historians in front of us who you need to grab the books, even though they might be £110 at Walmart. Still make sure you grab it. And also bombard Sam that she has to write a public history, like a popular history book on the subject, because I'm fed up of answering questions on her behalf. Thank you very much to our guests. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/historyhack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.